The third aspect that has to be established in order to demonstrate negligence is causation, and that's what I will be discussing in this video. So what is causation? You can think of causation as the actual cause that had created the damage that was suffered by the plaintiff. So was the defendant's negligence that actual cause that led to the plaintiff suffering from the damage? To determine whether that was the case or not, the courts look at two main aspects, and these are the factual causation and the legal causation. Let's start by looking at factual causation and what factual causation is. Factual causation is defined in the Civil Liability Act, and the Act requires that negligence was a necessary condition of the occurrence of the harm. So it was because of negligence by the defendant that the harm had occurred to the plaintiff. Now, there's a number of ways that the courts would determine how that was the case. One of the most common approaches is what is referred to as the but-for test. So the question that the court would ask to determine factual causation would be, but for the behavior of the defendant, would the harm to the plaintiff have occurred? So another way of rephrasing this would be, if it weren't for the behavior of the defendant, would the harm to the plaintiff have occurred? And if the answer is yes, then there would be no factual causation, and hence no negligence on the part of the defendant. Let me give you an example over here. Let's assume that there was a worker that wasn't wearing their safety harness while working on a roof, and the worker then fell. So that event, the worker falling down and injuring themselves, was it due to the employer's negligence? The question that the courts would ask when they want to determine factual causation is, but for the behavior of the employer, would the harm to the worker have occurred? And if the answer is yes, then there is no factual causation. Why would the answer be yes in this case? Well, even though the employer had provided the safety harness and asked the worker to wear that safety harness, it was known that the worker refuses to listen to their employer. So anyways, no matter how much the employer had stressed the importance of wearing that safety harness, the worker would have still refused to obey that instruction. And because of that, they fell, and hence there was no factual causation that would directly link the employer as the main source of the harm that had occurred to the plaintiff. Now let's look at legal causation. So legal causation is about the remoteness of the damage. And the test that is applied here is one of reasonable foreseeability. So that test we'd already seen when we talked about establishing a duty of care. The question that would be asked by the courts is whether the damages were within the scope of the liability. And if the answer is yes, then legal causation would be established. However, if the answer is no, then the damages that result due to the defendant's negligence were not foreseeable under the circumstances. Note that even though I said that it's a similar test to the one that we apply when establishing duty of care, it's applied in a different way. So in terms of its applications, it's a bit different. And to demonstrate that, I'll go through a legal case. So the case that we're looking at is the Overseas Tankship case and Mort Stock and Engineering. Australian case took place in the 60s. The facts of the case were as follows. There was a bunkering oil spill that drifted from Sydney Wharf, where welding was taking place. The oil spill was then set alight, and the ships that were at the wharf, some of them were burnt. There's an important point that I have to stress over here. Bunkering oil that's on water is really difficult to set alight. So when the case was brought forward to the court the court had to ask, was it foreseeable that the spilling of the oil in the water would cause damage? And the answer was yes. To the general public, it was foreseeable that such a risk, when it were to eventuate, it would cause damage to the general public, and hence the duty of care was established. But over here, our concern is with causation. So in terms of the legal causation, we're looking at whether the damage was remote or not. Was it foreseeable? Again, the court asked, was it foreseeable that a fire damage would have resulted? And the court, based on the facts of the case, found that it was not foreseeable. As I said, it was because setting bunkering oil alight on water is extremely difficult, and hence it was established that it was not foreseeable. The damage was too remote, and there was no legal causation.